Hi, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are, everyone. Thanks for coming. See a few familiar faces, but lots of new faces as well. So, or names anyway. And thank you for making time on your day to come join us. So my name's Mike Morell. I live in Paramus, New Jersey. Married with two older kids, and I work in finance. Um, and C.S. Lewis had a big impact on my life, and I feel motivated to share. And I'm happy to connect today my interest in C.S. Lewis to effective altruism. That's the topic for today. Um, and yeah, like Faisa said, we're recording, so yeah, cameras are optional, and please be on mute if you're there, so that the recording can come through pretty well. Thank you. All right. So the agenda for today, I'm going to give you a quick intro to Lewis and to effective altruism, not assuming any background from anyone on either of it. Then I'll kind of share my personal journey, how I got into EA and how Lewis affected that. And then I'm going to go back and kind of look at Lewis's writing and connect it to EA themes. Finally, we'll have some open Q&A, and then we'll adjourn to another reception room for further group discussion for whoever wants to stick around. Goals for today: I want to inspire Christian EAs who are already in this to kind of take further encouragement from Lewis. And if you're here as a Christian not really familiar with effective altruism, I wanted to introduce this sort of through C.S. Lewis and through what he said. And finally, if you're in effective altruism, whether Christian or not, I would hopefully give you some tips to use Lewis as a bridge to help other Christians connect with these topics. Few disclaimers: I am not a scholar of C.S. Lewis. My background's in economics. I don't claim to be an expert on Lewis. This is really coming from me personally, as opposed to any position of expertise. I'm also a sinner, falling short all the time of the things I try to do. So I think that's important, because whenever we talk about charity or being good or anything like that, there's always this risk of coming across sounding like we're talking about how good we are. And I hope it doesn't come out that way at all in any of these topics. Third, these views are my own. I don't speak for EA, for Christians, the organization, or for the wider movement. This is all coming from me. And finally, some apologies in advance for the dense slides. I don't give a lot of presentations, so I like to have the things in the slide to remind me what I'm talking about. And also, when I'm quoting C.S. Lewis, I found it really hard to stop. I would like to just find 4 or 5 key words and have them in a nice empty looking slide with the words in the center. But he's so good that I often found myself grabbing 3 or 4 sentences at a time and dumping them all on the slide because I couldn't figure out what to cut. All right, so a little bit of background. Who is C.S. Lewis? If you don't know him, he lived from 1898 to 1963, served in the trenches in the First World War, and was a professor, taught at Oxford and also at Cambridge. He was a friend to J.R.R. Tolkien, the Lord of the Rings author, and Tolkien was actually very influential in Lewis's faith formation. Most people probably connect Lewis to the Chronicles of Narnia. He's probably his most famous book that he wrote for children, fantasy novels. But he's also the author of numerous Christian works of devotion, apologetics, including Mere Christianity, which is probably the one that touched me the deepest and the one that we'll draw from the most in today's presentation. Okay, so, and by the way, if questions come up at all, feel free to, hold them to the end, or also paste them in the chat. I'll try to be watching the chat here. If there's anything I can answer during the talk, just pipe in there. Okay, so effective altruism, if you haven't heard of it before, what is it? Or also EA for short, we tend to call it. Well, it's both an idea and a community around that idea, where we focus on using evidence and careful reasoning to figure out the very best ways to improve the world, and then taking action on that basis. The key topics that come up in effective altruism include career planning and charity evaluation. So what do we do with our time and what do we do with our treasure, to put it in Christian terms? There are sort of some key institutions that organize all of this activity. 80,000 Hours is a famous name in career planning from an EA perspective. GiveWell evaluates charities based on their impact and does a lot of excellent analysis on how you can save the most lives or bring the most people out of poverty for a given donation. It's a really good resource, and it was important in getting me involved in EA. And then there's a Center for Effective Altruism, which kind of gathers lots of the projects that the community is working on and kind of promotes this general way of thinking. The term effective altruism was first coined in 2011. So you're not alone if you've never heard this word, this phrase before. But as we'll see, many of the ideas go back a lot earlier. We'll touch on how Lewis hit on many of these themes. And among other Christian thinkers, I think John Wesley, probably more than anyone else, there's a lot in his sermons that connect to these themes as well that we won't have time to get into today. Effective altruism emerged out of Oxford University. And as you might expect from that kind of, environment in 2011, it's heavily secular. So one of the things that was a little disorienting to me when I got involved in EA at the beginning was just how the heavy majority was not religious, how a lot of the way people talk is kind of not religious or even negative toward religion in some settings. So it was a little bit of an adjustment. I'm not one of those kind of I guess I'm not a Benedict option type person of wanting to run away from it. I'm more of a in the world but not of the world type of approach to these things. So I want to engage with these questions, even if as a Christian I sometimes find myself in the minority. So to that end, there's an organization called EA for Christians that a lot of us who are in this work kind of find fellowship and community in. It's an ecumenical global organization committed to serving others as well as possible. And we draw on these ideas from effective altruism, but we also bounce them off of everything else that we have in our faith. The programs include conferences, small groups, speaker events such as this one, and we have a charity campaign where we raise money for the top GiveWell charities as a Christian organization. This community formed in 2014. And not surprisingly, it also has roots in Oxford, like Lewis and like the EA movement. A couple of the early adopters of this group were from that area. And we just launched nonprofit orgs in the UK and the US this past year. You can find out more at eaforchristians.org or on Facebook, and we just welcome anyone who has an interest in this to come fellowship with us. Okay, so next I just wanted to share my own story. Why is this so important to me, and what did Lewis do for me? I'm tempted to somehow give Lewis tons and tons of credit for every good thing that's come up in my life. But when I was preparing this, I sort of thought back and said, there's a lot of other influences that led me to this as well. Parents and teachers. When I was a little kid, my mom was always putting on Highway to Heaven, this 80s TV show about an angel who walks the earth doing good things. She just had a moral outlook on a lot of things and was always trying to get me to think about moral questions. So, and then my dad was an actuary, always got me involved in math and poker and money problems. So he brought that analytical side out of me. So I can't say that there wasn't this latent, willingness to get involved in this kind of project. I also had some good teachers. I had a professor in college, Michael Sandel, who gave a whole course on moral philosophy called Justice that was really well done and kind of organized a lot of the history of moral philosophy. Certainly, I took some inspirations from that. Nevertheless, if you were to ask me about my outlook on faith and ethics, right around 2002, let's say. So I would have been 28 at the time, out of college, on the way to working in a financial career. I would have identified as a Christian. Yeah, sure. I believe in God. I believe in Jesus. I was brought up that way. If you looked at my behavior, I was kind of a Christmas and Easter type participant in church services. And if you looked at what I did with my time and my treasure, it was almost all about me and my family. I wanted to have a house and a car, and looking ahead to my next vacation and my retirement savings, and to the extent I thought about charity or about God's demands on any of this, it was, it was like, oh yeah, I'll give a little bit here and there. I want to be a good person. But I really, yeah, there's just so much that that changed later on. When I look back on that period, I almost think I was well below average, not in the sense of maybe anything particular I was doing, but in all those benefits that I had from parents and teachers that really set me up to think more deeply. I don't think I was doing much with it, honestly. So then, yeah, we started getting active in a local church when I had kids. So that was kind of a motivating factor there. And I came across C.S. Lewis and some of his books that were on the shelf there. And it was a time where I was really all of a sudden starting to read a lot about my faith, to read all the stuff on the internet, both for and against faith, that was really kind of questions I hadn't even thought of for most of my life. And at the end of that whole journey, I changed my mind on a few things, and I kind of evolved my faith in different ways. And I mean, it really felt like a conversion experience, if I had to describe it in the aggregate, that I came into it a very different type of Christian than how I came out of it in terms of it, of commitment and just how big this whole thing is. And there's one quote I'll share later on, but I'll preview it here. Is this, Lewis said that Christianity can either be of no importance or of infinite importance, but it can't be moderately important. And I think, yeah, probably the biggest change in my life as a result of Lewis was keeping that front and center when I wake up every day, that it's not something I should treat as moderately important. Now, coming out of that, especially some of the things that he taught about intellect and charity, it led me to just, to want to do better with the gifts that I had and to share. And especially as my finance career developed, I was fortunate and I was able to make some gifts, and I started thinking, well, how do I be deliberate about planning how to do the most good with all these gifts, and really, almost like in the parable of the talents, the Lord gives us gifts, but he wants a return. He not that he needs anything specific from us, but I think he's trying to train something in our character to really care, about what we're doing, about the gifts that we make. Sometimes it's said it's the thought that counts, and it's not about what the recipient, but it's about you and your own feelings. And I think that can be kind of dangerous advice. We're called to really love our neighbor as ourselves, and if we do that, we need to put some thought into what really helps people if we care about them, instead of just what's going on in ourselves. So Lewis led all that. I think put a lot of those things on my heart, and my goals for the future, I want to be a blessing to the maximum extent I can with the rest of my life, with whatever time and treasure the Lord gives me. So that's my story in a nutshell. And you might wonder, well, how did Lewis take that and lead me to something like effective altruism, which, as I've touched on earlier, is about this kind of rigorous analytical evaluation of charities and career planning. So let's get into that. And one question that might be of interest to people in the community is sort of, well, was C.S. Lewis an effective altruist? Was he kind of, without having that label, is that what he was? And I don't think that's the key question for today. First of all, Lewis would be the last person to hold himself up as an authority figure. As brilliant as he was also very humble, and he was always pointing people to other authorities than himself. Whether he would label himself as an EA is not something we can know, or whether he would agree with how I'm going to characterize some of his views is also not something we can know. And that's not really what's important here. I think what I'm thinking might be important here is if there's a good apologetic here, if there's a good story that leads people to EA the way it did to lead me to EA, that maybe it'll help some of you in terms of doing better in your own life or in helping others around you connect to these ideas through someone like Lewis, who's just beloved by people all across the spectrum in Christianity. So I'm going to break the next section up into a couple of parts. So, effective altruism, we're going to talk about how Lewis talked about effectiveness particularly, and then how he talked about altruism, and hopefully the pieces will start to fall into place. You don't need to dig very deep to find these themes in Lewis. All the quotes I'm going to share in blue on the next few slides are from Mere Christianity, his most famous work and the one I know the best. So we'll kind of jump right in, and probably the biggest thing is this section called Prudence in his book, where he says prudence is practical common sense, taking the trouble to think out what you're doing and what is likely to come of it. So there's a bit of what a philosopher would call a consequentialist streak in what Lewis is saying here, that it's not just about good intentions or good feelings, but about really bringing your thought process to consequences of our actions on others and on the world. And he calls this common sense. So Lewis is never claiming to introduce some novelty or he's always rediscovering something that's been in there all along, things that are have roots in scripture or in earlier thinkers than him, or even in the wider world. So later in that same chapter, we run into this, because Christ said we could only get into his world by being like children. Many Christians have the idea that provided that you are good, it doesn't matter being a fool. But that's a misunderstanding. As St. Paul points out, Christ never meant that we were to remain children in intelligence. On the contrary, he told us to be not only as harmless as doves, but also as wise as serpents. And there's actually a book that's kind of loosely affiliated with this movement. The author kind of speaks for himself, but the book title was Shrewd Samaritan, and it kind of stuck in my mind as maybe a connection of this shrewdness with the good heart that the Good Samaritan had. I think what Lewis is, Lewis often, he's not big on lots of footnotes on some of the things he says, but you can usually pick up what he's getting at. I think where he's quoting Paul here, or where he's alluding to Paul's probably 1 Corinthians 14:20, where he says, brothers and sisters, stop thinking like children. In regard to evil, be infants, but in your thinking, be adults. Furthermore, Lewis says, God wants us to have a child's heart, but a grown-up's head. He wants us to be simple, single-minded, affectionate, and teachable as good children are, but he also wants every bit of intelligence we have to be alert at its job and in first-class fighting trim. The fact that you are giving money to a charity does not mean that you do not need to try to find out whether that charity is a fraud or not. And I think you can kind of infer from this, not just whether it's a fraud or not, but whether it's effective or not. And this is where I think Lewis had far fewer tools available to him than the riches we have available to us at the present day, with the internet in particular, to get to the bottom of what charities are really doing. It's not just a question of are they frauds or not, right? Kind of the older names in charity evaluation, a site such as Charity Navigator, for example, does a pretty good job of screening for frauds and kind of telling you what are the bottom third of charities that you really want to stay away from. But there's a whole science and a discipline to finding the very best charities, that sort of top 1 or 2% in any given field, whether it's helping the poor or saving lives or anything else. And there's a lot of really good research that's out there that's gone into these questions. And some of the best charities are literally 100 times better than average charities in actually having an impact on the people they serve. I think it's incumbent on us, if we are giving to charity at all, which I think you should, and we'll get into that a little bit later, to put our best intelligence forward to examining these questions. And Lewis kind of goes on with this theme. He says, the fact that what you are thinking about is God himself, for example, when you're praying, does not mean you can be content with the same babyish ideas you had when you were a 5-year-old, or 25 or 45. We need to be growing, and not just staying in one place with regards to how we look at everything in our Christian walk, including charity. He then says, it is of course quite true that God will not love you any less or have any less use for you if you happen to have been born with a very second-rate brain. He has room with people for very little sense, but he wants everyone to use what sense they have, and obviously, and to use the best tools and data they have available. Now this last phrase kind of, I squirmed a little bit reading it. It sounded a little harsh from someone as gentle as Lewis to be, talking about second-rate brains. It almost sounded a little condescending, frankly, and I hesitate to use that quote as kind of leading into anything. But when you dig a little deeper, again, in Mere Christianity, I think you see what he really meant by it. He said some people may have made so little use of good heredity and good upbringing that they're really worse than people we regard as fiends. Can we be quite certain how we should have behaved if we had been saddled with the psychological outfit and then the bad upbringing, and then the power of, say, someone like Himmler? That is why Christians are told not to judge. We all have such different backgrounds and gifts, including brains. And we only see the results which a man's choices make out of his raw material. God does not judge him on the raw material at all, but what he's done with it. Most of the man's psychological makeup is probably due to his body. And when the body dies, all of that will fall off of him. And the real central man, the thing that chose, that made the best or worst out of this material, will stand naked. All sorts of nice things we thought were ours would fall away, and all sorts of nasty things will fall off of others. And we see everyone for the first time as he really was, and there will be surprises. He's obviously drawing on a lot of scriptures here. Probably to whom much has been given is the one that pops up to me from that. And obviously, if anyone here is kind of in the concerned with the use of gender, keep in mind this is 1952. Please don't judge Mr. Lewis for using man where obviously we could read person or humanity. But yeah, it's so this part about using whatever brains we have, it's not a put down to anyone who thinks more simply about charity questions. So along those lines, and this is a caution for my whole presentation, is I'm not assuming effective altruism is for everyone. Yes, in a sense, there are objective moral principles, right? And there are things that are better than others. However, if we take this sort of excitement about how much good data, good information there are to help more and more people, we risk coming across, or even worse, actually being in our hearts, judgmental about the best ways to give. And each of us has different gifts. So, maybe your friend that kind of their spirit goes with the wind and they have a simple heart and a simple mind, maybe effective altruism isn't what they're called to be doing. It's not something we have to beat over the shoulder with everybody to get on board with these things. However, there's a key principle that obviously the key principle, I think, in the New Testament of love your neighbor as yourself. So if you're the type of person on this call today, and you do a lot with reason and evidence and careful analysis, if you plan your finances well, if you shop for plane tickets with a lot of cleverness and expertise, if you read reviews on laptops and their specs, if you're planning your COVID risks, in some kind of intelligent way, all of those gifts that you got, you can use those for others too. You don't have to just go with the wind and give give to charity to whoever knocks on your door first, any more than you would buy a laptop from a door-to-door salesman. You can be deliberate and thoughtful in your career choices and in your charity choices, just as you are when you're loving yourself, because your neighbor matters and they can really benefit from your good choices if you plan things correctly. Okay, so we've talked about effectiveness and that effectiveness mindset that Lewis is throwing throughout his work. How about altruism? Yeah, you don't have to look very far for that either. Lewis says, you know, in the passage in the New Testament where everyone must work, it says, in order that he may have something to give to those in need. He's quoting Ephesians there. Charity, giving to the poor, is an essential part of Christian morality. In the frightening parable of the sheep and the goats, Matthew 25, you know, Lord, when did we see you hungry? It seems to be the point on which everything turns. But this is really serious. If we have, and one of the things that EA really teaches is that almost all of us have huge benefits in the West. You know, we're almost all the rich man in Scripture, in a sense, even if we don't feel like it relative to whoever's on our street or maybe somebody we see at work. But in the global scheme of things, we have amazing gifts and resources. And Jesus is there in every poor person, not just the one in front of us, if we've managed to shelter ourselves from that day to day, but the person, you know, 5,000 miles away that's living on $1 a day. That's Christ to me, and I'm going to have an account of did I respond to that need when I face Christ someday. And this is not to be a works versus grace kind of thing. I mean, I believe forgiveness is available for all of our sins. I believe Christ did a wonderful thing on the cross to make a way for salvation to all of us. So I please don't take it in that sense. But if our faith is genuine, I think good works should flow from it, and then we should take that very, very seriously. Lewis says, I do not believe one can settle how much we ought to give. I'm afraid the only safe rule is give more than we can spare. In other words, if our comforts, luxuries, etc., is up to the standard among those with the same income, we're probably giving away too little. So this is countercultural. There's no way around it. If you don't look a little odd to your friends in terms of how you think about money, there's a good chance that some of these principles coming from Scripture and haven't sunk in as deeply as they should. If our charities don't pinch or hamper us, Lewis says, I should say they're too small. There should be things we should like to do and cannot do because our charitable expenditure excludes them. It's both a tough test and an easy test. It's an easy test and easy, you know, he's not saying you have to, this isn't quite as demanding as what Christ asked the rich young man to do in terms of giving everything away. He's just saying, well, as a starting point, there should be some things that you can't afford because you're giving too much to charity. And I think if you looked at the finances of most, certainly most in the West, that wouldn't be the case for many of us. So it's this is pretty radical stuff. Now there's public versus private obligations, right? You know, well, how all these social problems, poverty in Africa, et cetera, how much of this is my problem versus the government's problem? Well, Lewis says some people nowadays say charity ought to be unnecessary. Instead of giving to the poor, we should produce a society in which there were no poor to give to. They may be quite right in saying we ought to produce that kind of society, but if anyone thinks that, and as a consequence, you can stop giving in the meantime, then he has parted company with all Christian morality. Now let's compare this to a name that comes up in effective altruism fairly often. And like I said at the beginning of the presentation, sometimes this is disorienting. It was for me when I started reading effective altruism websites that were very secular in nature, and they kept quoting this guy, Peter Singer. And Peter Singer, if you might know, aside from effective altruism, is a philosopher with a whole bunch of other ideas. He's an atheist. Many of his ideas are kind of antithetical to things like the sanctity of life. and treatment of the disabled, etc. So he's not always a friend of the church by any means. But it's striking how, and I think Lewis often points out how, with myth becoming fact and all this stuff, how even people far outside the church often are hearing the same voice of conscience speaking to them. So the comparison between Singer and Lewis is kind of interesting here. Singer, who's writing in 1971 in the middle of the Bangladesh famine, says, it's sometimes said that overseas aid should be a government responsibility. And this seems to assume that the more people there are who give to privately organized famine, the less likely the government will take over responsibility for such aid. This assumption is unsupported and does not strike me as at all plausible. The opposite view, that if no one gives voluntarily, a government will assume that its citizens are uninterested in famine relief and would not wish to be forced into giving aid, seems more plausible. And I agree that giving privately is not enough, and we ought to campaign for new standards for public and private contributions to famine relief. And I would sympathize with someone who thought campaigning was more important than giving, but I doubt whether preaching what one does not practice would be very effective. So yeah, he's writing after Lewis here, and I don't know if Lewis had any influence on him, but it's the same general idea, and this is very prevalent in effective altruism, the idea that, okay, the government will do what the government's going to do, but you're an individual, and these problems aren't solved, and you, in your own choices, have something you can do about it. You personally can save a life. The cost, according to GiveWell's estimates, is around $3,000. Now, if you saw someone drowning, to use an example Singer popularized, you saw a child drowning in a pond, and you would have to ruin a very nice suit to go in and save their life. Any decent person would do that, even if it cost $3,000 to save that child. But when we see something, when our brain analytically says, well, I can save a life for $3,000 by giving to health programs in Africa, it doesn't have the same emotional impact. But I think Lewis would challenge us to say, well, why not? If your intellect can grasp that, and you don't act on it, what does that say? And this is challenging. I mean, this is not easy. And again, like I said at the beginning, I don't do this very well. I'm trying, but I'm falling short as often as I'm doing good things. And Lewis understood this in his own life. And he said, for many of us, the great obstacle to charity is not in luxurious living or desiring more money, but just in fear of insecurity, right? I mean, how often do you hear an advertisement from a retirement planner saying, this is how much you need to retire, have you saved it yet? And until you get to that number, you're afraid, right? There's a chance unless you have $1 billion or something, there's a chance you're going to run out of money, and that's scary. And that's, I think, what holds most of us back in terms of how hard it is to part with money, even when someone needs it way more than we do. Lewis also says sometimes our pride hinders our charity. We're tempted to spend more on the showy forms of generosity, tipping, hospitality, than those who really need our help. I think he's alluding here to the Sermon on the Mount, right? Jesus is saying many types of giving where it's socially acceptable and normal, you're getting your own reward. People are saying thank you. So if you're helping out in your local community, to someone face to face, you're often getting, oh, thank you so much for showing up, for doing this. Thank you for this gift. I personally appreciate it. If you help someone 5,000 miles away, you may never know their name, let alone get a thank you. That makes giving sound impersonal, doesn't it? Like, you hear people say, oh, you can't just write a check. You got to be hands-on. I don't know. I mean, that thank you is nice, but if that gift overseas does 100 times more good than the one local where there's many more charities working, I'm not sure that's the right way to look at it. I mean, even Christ, when he was helping lepers, right? How many of them came back to say thank you? 1 out of 10, if I remember. So yeah, I see myself in these passages. So I'm working on both of these. It's much easier to be generous to a friend and buy them a gift that's really nice and even over the top than it is to give to someone who can't thank you, who can do nothing for you in return. But I really think in the Gospels, that's where Jesus lights up, and you did this for him. So I really encourage you to take that point, if nothing else, away from this this talk. The ordinary idea of morality, Lewis talks about, well, sometimes the ordinary self wants to do things that are wrong and we must give them up. And other times what the self didn't want to do turns out to be right and we'll have to do them. And this is something I definitely relate to. He says, we are hoping that when all the demands have been met, the poor natural self will have some chance and some time to get on with its own life and do what it likes. We are very much like an honest man paying his taxes. He's talking about something. I think if you've been in EA for a while, this will resonate maybe more than if you're hearing about these things for the first time. But there's this sense that it's so demanding, right? It's all this. I could spend $10 on this, or it could go save. It could be a whole week's income for someone in Africa. It's not for the faint of heart. It's kind of, it's demanding stuff. And you just wish that there was some little tax you could pay that would satisfy all the moral demands. And then you could go back to, the way I described thinking in 2002, where, okay, what do I do next? I got this money. Should I take a vacation or make the house better, or what do I do next? But Lewis says the Christian way is in a sense both harder and easier. And what he means by that is Christ is saying, that's not how to look at it. I'm not collecting a tax. I want your all. I don't want just X amount of money and time. I want you, and I want you to hand over your natural self, and I'll give you a new self instead. I'll give you myself. And this is both harder and easier than what we're trying to do, right? Harder in the sense that Christ said, he describes this as taking up your cross, which Lewis says is like going to be beaten to death in a concentration camp. It sounds horrible. Frankly, it sounds scary, right? But the next minute he turns around and says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And one can see just why both are true. So this is pretty deep stuff, I think. It's really, really hard when you grasp some of these things and then you connect them to all the problems in the world and all the ways that we have power to help. And just how perfect Jesus is asking us to be. It's hard, but he's not asking us, to figure everything out ourselves and be judged on how successful we are. Because guess what? We're not going to solve all the world's problems, and we're going to fall short sometimes. But the yoke is easy. I think, this is me speaking. I think he's relating to, well, there's not a lot of arbitrary rules to follow, right? You don't have to worry about what kind of fabrics you're wearing, or whether you're eating shellfish, or all the rules that applied in the older times. It's just follow him, love your neighbor as yourself. And when you fall short, if you put your faith in him and your trust in him, he's got your back with the Father, and all will be well, all will end well. So yeah, it's both hard and easy, and Lewis speaks to that in a wonderful way. He also applied all this in his own life. I mean, he never held himself up in his own work. You don't see much of this at all, but one of his biographers goes through all the ways he put his faith into action. He cared for 30 years for the mother of a friend who was killed in the war. He opened up his home to children who were evacuated during the air raids. He took time to connect with people individually. When he got letters, he replied to each and every one of them. He really took time every day to keep up and treat people the way he would want to be treated. And specifically in the financial sense, Lewis ran into problems early on because he was so generous. He gave away essentially all of his royalties from his early writings, and ran into trouble where he owed taxes more than what he could afford, because he'd given all the money away, even though he'd owed taxes on it. So later on in life, Lewis asked his lawyer to set up a charitable trust, with 2/3 of his book earnings going into that trust. And he distributed the proceeds to widows and orphans, usually anonymously. Some estimates say that 90% of Lewis's income went to charity. despite his father's fear of being bankrupt. I know I'm rambling here, but there's a lot of good stuff. I'm going to try to wrap up before 2 and leave some time for questions. So just a few cautions from all of this. Sometimes effective altruism seems synonymous with utilitarianism, the idea that all of our morality can be reduced to one value and be measured and quantified. Lewis obviously cautions against that kind of approach. There's a quote from Mere Christianity here where, if you take any one thing and set it up as the thing to follow at all costs, you might turn into a devil. And even love of humanity in general is not entirely safe if you leave out justice. There's a lot more we could say on this kind of impulses of nature. There's one EA writer who talks about being 2/3 utilitarian as a kind of compromise to really focus on helping people to the maximum you can, but to leave room for all these other values that we need to keep in mind. Another counterpoint in Lewis's work, he quotes this expression, cold as charity, and talks about how patronizing and unsympathetic charitable people often are. Many of us start out trying to do things, really anxious to do good, and somehow it doesn't turn out that way. And we need to focus on what's going on the inside of our own souls. He doesn't mean that we're supposed to stop trying to be good, but if you find yourself in a battle with a dirty rifle, you shouldn't run away, was his analogy. But the real cure is cleaning ourselves on the inside, and Christ is essential for that. Some of you who know Lewis well might recognize Chesterton and MacDonald as some of his influences. It will be a little more difficult to come up with a presentation supporting effective altruism from the work of Chesterton and MacDonald. They were very critical of philanthropists, especially Rockefeller in their day. I think the context is important, so I'm not saying they would be opposed to these ideas, but it's not there on the surface maybe as much as it is in Lewis. But if you haven't been exposed to either of these authors, I recommend them both. They're very warm and generous souls who I took a lot from after discovering them through Lewis. There's no stories of Lewis having taken a detailed interest in charity evaluation, not using things like GiveWell that didn't exist. Lewis wasn't talented in math or investments, so he wasn't doing this kind of analysis. Some of this might be a little unfamiliar to him. In God in the Dock, he talked about gambling and said, if anyone comes to me asking to play bridge for money, I just say, how much do you hope to win? Take it and go away. So this analytical approach to finances is something that maybe Lewis wouldn't recognize right off the bat if he saw it in GiveWell or in one of these institutions. So what did I see? I am a math guy. I'm a finance guy. What did I see in this writings? And like I said earlier, it's that full commitment to bring your whole intellect, whatever God gave you, into loving your neighbor, because this thing is not moderately important. Ordinary morality, the man on the street, I'll give a little bit here and I'll pay my taxes and mostly spend on having fun with life and do what I want. That's not too demanding, but Christianity, I think, rightly construed, is pretty demanding, and EA at least gets at that. So even secular people in EA, they often are confronted with the demandingness of these ideas, and it really strikes them. And it must be difficult, I think, to relate to those ideas outside of a Christian context, because at least we know we're going to fall short, and it's not a surprise, and we have a savior and all of that. Couple of points, I'll be quick in these last couple slides to leave some time. If you start reading Effective Altruism, you see a lot of interest in animals and in the long term, mostly because EA is focused on neglected causes. So it's not saying that one thing is more important than another. It looks at basically where charities are putting their money relative to the scale of various problems and what seems to be underfunded. So animals in the long term are often kind of top of mind for some EAs. Others, myself included, think of global poverty as probably the still the center point of EA type analysis, but there's room for different opinions in the community. Lewis was an advocate for animals. He was consistently in favor of being kind to them, and he was opposed to vivisection as a terrible practice. But he didn't speak to factory farming and some of the modern problems of animal welfare. He wasn't a vegetarian himself. And like many of us, he kind of confessed doubts about, I don't know, what are our obligations to animals? How high up the chain do animals have a self or a soul that has experiences? He wrestled with this a lot in The Problem of Pain, kind of a little too much to get into today. He even thought, some animals might experience through us some kind of immortality. So it's not a subject we should neglect, I think. But yeah, it's not an easy topic either. But Lewis has things to say on that, is all I wanted to hit on with these slides. Finally, long-termism. A lot of EAs are concerned about the long-term future, where the stakes are very high, things like nuclear war and pandemics and artificial intelligence. Lewis gives a word of caution to that kind of thinking. Remember, in the world's last night, we have to remember Christ could come back at any time. The end of the universe is not necessarily when the last star burns out. It's whenever the curtain drops, whenever Christ decides to come back. So neglecting everyone who's alive today for the sake of some far future is a problematic way of thinking. Doesn't mean those problems aren't important, or that they might not be neglected relative to other problems. But if you make them front and center and they conflict with other problems in the here and now, that's a potential problem. On the other hand, Lewis was, within the ordinary limits of morality. Looking ahead 100 years is fine. There are a lot of problems that do need work that could affect us in the coming century, serious threats to humanity. So I think we're well within our rights to be looking at those. So that's my summary. Sorry it went so long, but there's just so much to talk about when it comes to C.S. Lewis. He didn't engage with everything in EA. I didn't give you a full summary of what EA is all about, but hopefully I gave you a taste for it. And if you're new to this community, I hope you come back to one of our events. And there's a lot of wonderful people in this community and a lot of fellowship in trying to live out in this way.